Okay, if you're watching this, that means you missed my lecture. So posting this online, so I'm pretty fast. I'm going to skim through it. But the Cold War is right after World War II, right? So if World War II finally ends, and the way it ends is actually really important. It ends with Europe. It obviously ends with Hitler's suicide, and as we march through one side of Europe, and the Soviets march to the other side. But in Japan, it ends with the dropping of 2 atomic bombs. So we always say that, hey, what ended World War II? Dropping of 2 atomic bombs in Japan. But it also started something else. It started the arms race. Using those atomic bombs, what Truman did was start an arms race with Soviet Union, also known as Russia now. But nonetheless, that's the beginning of the Cold War. The arms race of the Cold War starts right when he drops those atomic bombs. Our mortal enemy from post-World War II to the 1990s, and I guess now, again, is Russia, aka Soviet Union. Back then, the guy is Stalin. Communist dictatorship in charge of Soviet Union, has ultimate say-so. These guys were our mortal enemy for quite a while, but there's always been tension between us. If you think after World War I, we had the Red Scare, we had like communists, things like that. It shouldn't be surprised that we're getting to this point where it's so bad that we actually despise each other. I do understand in World War II, we were best friends, we were allies, we fought Hitler, we defeated Germany. But this is after World War II. Now we've got no common enemy. And what happens after World War II is there's world powers, right? Like we always talk about the Spanish-American War, the United States became a world power. There are lots of world powers, France, Great Britain, Germany, Russia, world powers. But after World War II, there's only 2 superpowers, us and them. And that's what the whole world looks like. There's a big difference between what we call Soviet communism and American democracy. And we talk about these different ideologies. I always use examples to make the economic system more understandable. Think for a second, if in a Soviet communist area, they're not going to allow private ownership of land. Literally, they did this when they took control after World War I. If you own land, they took that land up and they collected all the land together and they put many people to work that land. So in my classroom, I use this example. This classroom, Mr. Brown's classroom, is one farm. The guy across the hall, Mr. M, his is another farm. Mr. Akers is another farm. And all my students are my workers on this farm, giant farm. Well, we sow, reap, take care of the crop. We eventually have a ton of corn. And typically what happens is you take the corn you need, and then the rest of it, the government comes by and it's going to give it somewhere else, somebody else. That extra corn, now you got enough to eat, good job, but that extra is going to go somewhere else. Maybe Mr. M had a drought this year and they didn't have enough food to feed themselves. We're going to give them some. Mr. Akers' class just sucks at farming, so we got to give them some. And then you got to feed the people in the city. Now that's all fine and dandy, like we get what we need, like we'll get health care, we'll get other stuff instead of it, so it seems fair. But over time, year after year after year, we start to realize one thing on my farm. No matter how much corn we grow, we don't get any extra. No matter how much harder we work, no matter how much more extra corn we grow and reap, we don't get anything extra from it. So why should we try harder? As a matter of fact, we do little and little, and if we can't afford, if we don't have enough food, some other farm might take care of us just the way we keep taking care of everybody else. So over the course of years and years and years, you start to see why the system falls apart. Now compare that to the American side. If you own the land, and say I own this land, I farm it to grow a whole bunch of corn, I take the extra corn, it's mine. I can sell it, take that money, I can buy more land, I can expand, I can buy more tractors, I can buy I can pay workers to work for me. I can buy cars, I can buy whatever I want. Now, every year, I'm going to grow as much corn as possible because I get to spend that money I made from the corn. You don't get that in Soviet communism. That's the biggest difference between economic systems. One, strict, almost total government control versus one that's not. And if you're thinking, well, Mr. Brown, hey, China's not exactly like that. Cuba's not exactly like that. North Korea's not exactly like that. You're right. Communism does vary country to country. China has special economic zones, which changes the whole dynamics of them, but it also helps them very well as a power. But nonetheless, those are the basic difference in economic systems. And economics is agriculture, whether you realize or not, that's part of the system too, especially if that's your #1 export. But nonetheless, Soviet communist strict government control. Here we've got private ownership. The government is involved, but not near as much as in a communist side. The next thing on is religion, which is actually really important for us to understand. If you take a look at this next slide, 1950s, the United States is going to go through a change. Congress passes a bill and Eisenhower signs it into place. We decide our original motto, E pluribus unum, which stands for out of many, one, like out of many colonies, one country, out of many people, one American, right? Very patriotic, E pluribus unum is Latin for out of many, one. We decided to change that in 1950s to in God we trust. Why? More political, more of a big jump. 2 years before this, we add the words under God to the Pledge of Allegiance. That actually didn't exist until the 50s. Okay? But we do this because our enemy, our mortal enemy, the Soviets, these guys don't allow religion. And we want to show the world that we're the moral ones, we're the Christian ones, we're God-fearing ones, and those are the godless, evil ones. It's clearly sounds stupid now, especially nowadays, but back then it was just this concept that we're going to show the world that we're the Christian ones, we do believe in God, and they don't. They're evil, godless creatures, essentially. That's the reason why we do this. So I want to start our state test. They've asked questions from, hey, what does E pluribus unum translate to? Out of many, one. Or they've asked why, and the whole idea is to show our adversaries, they usually don't say Soviet Union, but to show our adversaries that we were religious people. It's a very simple concept, but it is pretty funny when you consider the extent that we've taken it 50 years later. Now, the Cold War itself, the arms race is pretty obvious. We're all racing to get the strongest, biggest bombs, but now the Cold War itself actually has its roots during World War II. And these are two different conferences, the Yalta Conference and the Potsdam Conference, and I've always asked students the biggest difference between these two, the man in the middle. Here, FDR is president in Yalta Conference. Here's Potsdam. FDR's died, and his vice president Truman has taken over. And this is a game changer. Because in Yalta Conference, you can even see the body language of Stalin. He doesn't mind leaning in the picture with Roosevelt. These guys are actually really good friends. He called him Uncle Joe. They both would make fun of Churchill for being colonizer at one point. So they got along really great. But over here, things are entirely different. Yeah, they're happy. Germany's defeated. In Potsdam, we got to figure out what we're going to do with Japan. So yeah, they're happy, but they're not close. Stalin has a big distrust of Truman. Truman doesn't like Stalin. It's almost like these two against him now. And what happens at Potsdam is really interesting. If you actually look into this, you'll see that they're getting ready to negotiate how they're going to deal with Japan. You know, Truman is going to want the Soviets to help him. You know, you made this promise to us that if we helped you with Germany, you would come help us with Japan. But in doing so, Stalin's making all these demands. Truman looks at what happened in Germany. In Germany, Truman realizes, hey, Stalin's taking over parts of Germany. He's not giving free elections. Stalin's taking over parts of Europe as he marches towards Germany. Stalin's not giving them free elections. So Truman really doesn't want Stalin involved in this war with Japan, but he needs it. We can't do it alone. And then right here at Potsdam Conference, Truman actually gets word that a new bomb has been tested and it works. That's the atomic bomb. So when they actually do meet later on at the same conference, Potsdam Conference a little bit later, once Truman meets Stalin, he pretty much blows him off. Kind of just, we don't need him. And Stalin is very suspicious. Like, you can imagine, like, if he's just like, why doesn't this guy want my help? How come he's not giving in to my demands? Like, he needs me. Why does he act like he doesn't need me? Why does he not care anymore? It's because Truman knew he had the bomb. He was willing to use it. So the differences between us and them really start before Japan even surrenders. Before we even finish World War II, you see the things emerge. Could have been way different if we had FDR still. If FDR had died, how different it may have been. But as I talked about earlier, remember from our last sections, how Soviets, they marched across towards Germany to defeat Germany. They went across Eastern Europe. And as they took over these countries here, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, they installed what we call puppet governments. The government is communist. And if you're not communist, the Soviets overthrew you. Okay? You could be a ruthless, evil, stupid, dumb person, but if you're communist, they kept you in charge. And so you see why some people are just like, yeah, I'm communist, I'm in charge. Bye. essentially you see why it all became communist. As he takes over, he installs communists, doesn't give them free elections at all. Okay, so the easiest way to recall and remember this is that East Europe, and it makes sense, becomes communist. Okay, in Germany itself, when we get to Germany, we decide to divide up. Right, Germany is too powerful. They don't do too much. What we're going to do here is have an American sector, a French sector, a British sector, and a Soviet sector. Okay. Now, if you look at the Soviet sector, the capital of Germany is in Berlin, and we thought that was unfair. And so we said, hey, you can have the capital of Berlin, but half of it should be Soviet, the other half should be American, and that was the way. So that was the way it was decided. So it's kind of weird. We look at this. All of this section is Soviet, except Berlin itself, the city. It's half Soviet, half not. I know, it sounds like we just couldn't agree on anything, and it's probably right the way it seemed like it was going. After a while, though, you will see these three sections merge. The British and French, Americans decide, hey, we're all on the same page. Let's merge and make it West Germany, and we'll call them East Germany. Okay. You can see, like, if I was Stalin, this would upset me, and we'll explain that in a little bit in just a second. Now, these areas that were under control by the Soviet Union, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, all these areas, they're often called satellite countries. And that's just because they're so close to the Soviet Union. Just like the moon is so close to Earth in comparison to everything else, right? So just keep that in mind. If you see that word satellite, that's what we're talking about. This Iron Curtain phrase is made by Churchill. He says there is an Iron Curtain descending across Europe, dividing it in half between communist side and the democracy side. And it's pretty much a phrase that Churchill uses at a commitment ceremony at a college with a graduating class, and it really catches, essentially goes viral, as we would say nowadays. But this Iron Curtain separated East Europe and West Europe, right? And then we got East Germany versus West Germany. Then you even got East Berlin versus West Berlin. East side is always communist, easiest way to remember that. Now, one thing you do need to know, and if you're in class, I'll tell you guys to circle the word containment policy. Essentially, this is a policy America's going to use for the next 50 to 70 years. Even now, it kind of is a concept. And it means we're not going to go in and overthrow any communist area, but we're going to stop communism from spreading. Contain it where it's at. It's called a containment policy. Now, the big first test of the containment policy comes to Truman in Europe. If you actually look at this map, you see in Europe, Greece and Turkey are really close to the Soviet Union, and Truman has a problem. Essentially, what's going on in Greece is they have a rebellion. These rebels are trying to overthrow the democracy government in Greece, and these are communist rebels. Now, we said we're not going to let communism spread. And then over here in Turkey, they apparently owe Soviets money, and the Soviets are threatening to invade Turkey. We can't let communism spread. The containment policy says no spreading. Okay? But the Truman Doctrine is put in place. Truman looks at the containment policy and goes, okay, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to release a statement called the Truman Doctrine. He says, we will give any military aid to any country fighting communism in Europe, specifically for Europe. Okay? And he's referring to Greece and Turkey specifically. So those communist rebels in Greece, we're going to give the Greece government weapons to crush those rebels. Turkey owes the Soviets money. What can we do to keep them from invading? I know. We'll put missile silos in Turkey. So if Soviets do try to invade Turkey, Turkey can fire them off into Russia. Well, eventually we'll put nukes here where we can actually hit Moscow. So that way the Soviets know not to invade those too. So that's how we stop communism from spreading. That's our containment theory, right? You do need to know the containment policy. Truman Doctrine just says specifically we're going to provide military aid for those countries in Europe that fight communism. And I do want you to make sure you understand it's Greece and Turkey. That's very clear on the TEKS. I want you to understand that. It's been asked on STAAR test specifically which two countries it involved, and it always helps you with any political cartoons such as this one. You see cartoons about, hey, aid to Greece and Turkey. Immediately that should click your mind. Say, this is talking about the Truman Doctrine. What's that about? Just so you understand that. Okay. It went all the way back there. Sorry. Wrong button. So make sure you know that containment policy, that definition referred to a lot. Truman Doctrine, just for Europe, and specifically Greece and Turkey were the ones that got the first help from it. The Marshall Plan is another big step that we take. Marshall essentially is this, he was chief of staff in World War II, really important. He was literally nicknamed the organizer of victory for World War II. He reported directly to FDR. Post-World War II, he gives a speech. He has a great idea. He says, hey, we should learn lessons from the past. After World War I, Germany was so bad, so miserable with hyperinflation and chaos that people gave up on democracy and they elected essentially Hitler. They gave him power. And he's looking at what's going on in Europe now, and he's like, man, if things are real bad on this side of Europe, on the west side of Europe, what if it's so bad that they try communism and they become communist? He goes, we can stop that. He says, okay, we're gonna learn our lesson from World War I. We're not gonna ask for any debt that's owed to us. We're gonna erase all debt these countries owe to us. And two, we're gonna give them money. We're gonna give these countries money so they can rebuild their infrastructure, their roads, their bridges, their buildings, whatever it is. We'll give them money, make life so awesome for them. Will they ever wanna be like communism over here? And two, the communists will see how great life is over there in democracy, and they will want to become democracy. They would want a capitalist economy. They would like that. They think it's great. Look how wonderful. Well, here they have hot water, cars, nice roads, good schools, nice buildings. And over here, they don't have that. Wouldn't you want that? Wouldn't you want that democracy and capitalism? That is a Marshall Plan, essentially giving financial aid, lots of financial aid to countries. Up here it says Europe. Technically that's not true. It wasn't limited to just Europe, but that's just a detail you don't have to worry about too much. But always remember Marshall Plan, financial aid to Europe. Now earlier we talked about how these four sides would band together to make West Germany. And I mentioned how would Stalin feel about that if he woke up one day and they're like, hey, all your enemies just joined forces as one country. He'd be upset. So Stalin, in his stupor of just anger, decides, all right, fine. This part of Berlin that you guys have, this west part of Berlin, no more, no mas. I am going to cut you off. All the roads and railroad tracks, everything leading up to West Berlin, where we could supply our team, our West Berlin team, our side, all those roads. Stalin goes, I'm not letting you go anymore. This is my territory. I'm blocking those roads and railroad tracks off. No supplies are allowed to West Berlin. What are you gonna do about that? So again, Truman looked at this. And this is a perfect example of the Cold War. We made a move, we banded together. Stalin made a move, he blocked the roads. Our next move, are we gonna bomb him and start war? No, it's a Cold War. We never actually start fighting each other, okay? Our move is an airlift. Truman decides we're going to airlifts. Every 4 minutes, planes are going to take off, and they get about 15 minutes separated. If you actually look up video on this, it's really interesting. They have planes stacked in line behind each other. They load them up, they take off. They literally have them on different heights so they don't crash into each other. They land, unload, and then come head straight back. Over a year this happens. The Berlin airlift, that's what this is, circle it and know it. Berlin airlift will actually last over a year, and it just shows you that we weren't going to let communism spread. Not even half a city, not 1 inch. Over a year, we're spending all this money just to make sure communism doesn't spread. And after a year, Stalin gives up. Stalin says, okay, fine, you can start using the roads, the railroad tracks again. This isn't working for anybody. You can come on through. But the Berlin airlift is a big thing. So you can see how the Cold War is like a chess move, like I'm gonna do this, you can do this. Nobody's really making the first attack. That's how I always think of Cold War. The Berlin airlift is a perfect example. Now, it does take another leap, actually, and this affects us to this very day. Essentially, many countries are worried that Soviets would attack, right? What if they attack Turkey? What if they attack Italy? So we have the creation of NATO, which stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So these countries in North Atlantic, they're all going into a treaty. Pretty much they say, hey, attack on one of us, it's attack on all of us. So you attack Italy, we'll attack you. Obviously, they're talking to the Soviet Union when they make this agreement, the NATO agreement. And the Soviets are so upset, they say, fine, we'll do the same thing. And they meet in Warsaw, and even though they pretty much control these countries already on this side, they have the Warsaw Pact, which is essentially the same thing. Now on this map, it doesn't say anything about the Middle East, Asia, or Latin America, but this becomes part of the Cold War. This is the world of the Cold War. People have to pick a side. And if you're on a communist side and you're close to home, we're gonna overthrow your government, and we're gonna install somebody that's not. If you look at Latin America, El Salvador had a civil war where 1/3 of the population was killed. We started that. Guatemala, look up banana wars. The new president there talked about workers' rights, and the CEO of a banana plantation came to his brother-in-law who was in the CIA and convinced him that they were communists and to overthrow the Guatemalan government. In the Middle East, We put people in charge that we didn't like, people that would kill their own people. Dictators for 30 years in Libya, Saddam Hussein in Iraq. We loved them because they were anti-communist. That's all we cared about. In Asia, oh man, in Asia we can go on and on because we're going to talk about that in a little bit with the Korean War and Vietnam War. All everybody was forced to deal with this Cold War that originally was just between the United States and the Soviet Union. And then it spread to what we see here. So make sure you know what NATO is, make sure you understand its concept, defending each other no matter what. And notice Soviet's response was Warsaw Pact. Okay. Now, essentially Stalin is gone. Once you find us die, there is a new president, he's Khrushchev. And this fast forwards to the 60s when it was first built. But there's a Berlin Wall. People often ask about the Berlin Wall. For our state test, it's not asked about, but just understand the biggest fear, biggest problem they had in the Soviet Union was people fleeing Russia or fleeing the Soviet Union. They would get to East Germany, go inside Berlin, walk from East Berlin over to West Berlin, and now they're on the American side, and they could fly out to America. The Soviets were losing celebrities, scientists, writers. It was really embarrassing and hurting them to lose all these important people. And so essentially, Khrushchev, the leader of Russia, builds the Berlin Wall that gets, by 1983, you can see what it looked like by 1983, some parts of it got so in depth, it was unreal what they did, from anti-tank crossings that we've seen before, to sandbanks, to watchtowers, to border guards, to bunkers, to dog washers, to spikes in the ground. And that was actually the official border. That was the Berlin Wall, but all of this was added in front of it. So that if you're coming from the Soviet side, you would never be able to make it. Never be able to make it. There's actually a picture of the Berlin Wall. You can see this side, on this side, with the painting. That's clearly democracy, because you get that freedom of speech. People can go up to a wall, they don't care. But on the other side, it's spotless clean. Soldiers were marching to make sure nobody can escape back over. So Berlin Wall is just another step in the tension of the Cold War, if you will. And that's in the 60s, so it's kind of cheating a little bit, but it's worth mentioning. Now, going back to 49, actually, it's one of the toughest years. Communism takes hold of China in 1949. And Mao Zedong is leader of the communists. He defeats the nationalists. Nationalists was a pro-democracy one. So anytime you hear the word nationalist, we're typically thinking pro-democracy. Now, the nationalists of China, in their defeat, the last of them will run and flee to Taiwan. And they exist this very day. And China has constantly threatened to invade Taiwan to this very day. But shortly after the nationalists did this, originally in 49, we make the declaration. The United States, Truman says, we will defend Taiwan if anybody attacks it at all costs. And so over the past 70 years, China has essentially threatened, wanted to take Taiwan. If you buy a map in China, Taiwan doesn't exist, it's part of China. But so is Tibet, which is just ridiculous. That's just the way China is, really. But nonetheless, China will always make that threat to take back Taiwan. To be fair, Taiwan says that when they'll take back mainland China and bring back democracy. That's obviously not going to happen. But we depend a lot on Taiwan in modern times for chip conductors, for chips, for everything from the microchips in cars to computers. Everything we really depend a lot on Taiwan, and it's a big worry. In modern times, we worry that with things going on in the world, Russia and Ukraine, that China's just waiting for a good excuse because they think there's no way the world can deal with helping Ukraine and helping Taiwan. And so it's very scary. Ever since Truman made that pledge, hey, we're going to protect Taiwan no matter what, it becomes a real issue. At the time when China tries to join the United Nations, Truman says, nope, no communists are going to be allowed, and we use our veto. Because we have founded the United Nations, we have veto rights, and refuse to allow Red China into it. The main thing on tests when they ask about this is really where the nationalists flee to, Taiwan. And that's because you got to understand that Taiwan's a really sticking issue even to today. All right? Another advancement in Cold War, another problem with Cold War is the Korean War. Now your generation is really great. You guys know there's a difference between North and South Korea. You know that North Korea is communist dictatorship, and you know South Korea is not. It's like a mini US. Well, this dates, the reason why this happens now is because you go backwards 70 years to 1950s, and you see that post-World War II, this is how it started. Japan had given up all their land, and so after World War II, we're dividing it all up. Us and Soviets arguing about the Korean Peninsula. Essentially, we decide, hey, you guys can have North, make it communist, South, and make it pro-democracy. Like everything else, we just divide up the people without giving them any input. And over time, North Korea is convinced by Stalin in China to invade South Korea. Say, hey, North Korea, you want to unite your peninsula, you want the Korean people to be whole again? Great, you should do it now. Attack South Korea, take over. One, don't worry about the Americans. There's only a few hundred military advisors, not even soldiers, military advisors there. Two, don't worry about Americans because nobody cares about what's going on way over here. They're worried about Europe, but they're not going to mess around over here. And so North Korea does that. And you can see North Korea, once they bust through that pre-war boundary, boom, they almost take the whole peninsula. Truman talks to General MacArthur and says, what do you need? Let's get this done. MacArthur takes a brave risk. Of course, he's going to reinforce his guys at the bottom. He also lands halfway through and pushes them all the way up. All the way back up to the border of China, who is again also communist. And all of a sudden, Marines are radioing back in. Hey, the North Koreans have reinforcements, blah, blah, blah. Or they say the Chinese are coming, and the general's like, they're not Chinese, there's North Koreans, you guys are idiots. Essentially, there's a lot of confusion, but it turns out over 100,000 Chinese will cross over and begin to help North Korea. Immediately we say, whoa, 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 China, this is an act of war. Are you declaring war on us? And China says, whoa, we don't know who those people are. We don't know where those Chinese 100,000 people got those weapons, uniforms, and tanks. Well, I don't know how they got those. Those are just civilians doing what they want. We can control everybody. Sorry about that. Now nobody buys this. You don't buy it, I don't buy it, nobody buys it. MacArthur doesn't buy it. MacArthur actually goes to Truman. He says, hey Truman, we need to use atomic bomb on China. Drop a few atomic bombs on them so they back out of North Korea and let us finish the job. Now Truman says no, we can't just drop the atomic bomb whenever we want, we can't do this. MacArthur's reaction, fine, I'll go to the press. He goes to the public and he says, Truman's weak, he's scared, we gotta drop the atomic bomb on China, we gotta do it to win. He didn't have what it takes to be a president, to be a good leader. And so if you're Truman, you know what you gotta do? You gotta fire the guy. Now if you fire a war hero, do you think people will re-elect you? You guess right, he doesn't get reelected. Instead, this man gets reelected, gets elected. Eisenhower. This is when he was in the military during World War II. Remember, he's a commander of all of Europe. He explained to Truman what's going on in Europe. Years later, when he comes back, he runs for the White House. He retires the military uniform. He retires, and he becomes a regular civilian, and he runs for the White House, and he wins his election against Truman. And this picture's here of Truman prepping him to take over the White House. And even if guys ran back in the day, before recently, in the past few years, you always helped the other side transition because you wanted it for your country. You never were a sore loser and crybaby. That's new. That's never happened. That used to happen, right? But Eisenhower comes in, and when he comes in, he promises to end the war in Korea, and he does. He gets an armistice. Now, armistice is not a treaty. Armistice says, time out, we're gonna stop fighting, let's talk about a treaty. But they get the armistice in 1953, and they get a decision that we're gonna put it across a 38th parallel, which is 38 degrees north, essentially. It's called 38th parallel, and we're gonna make it a demilitarized zone, meaning that Army can be there like those guys, but not tanks, anti-aircraft, or aircraft, nothing major military there on this border, and they never get a treaty. They never get a treaty. Technically, we're still fighting with them, but not actual fighting. And over 70 years, North Korea has grown so different than South Korea. And you guys know this. In North Korea, how horrible conditions are. It's called Hermit Kingdom. They don't have electricity in most places. It's pretty poor off. We're not sure how the people are doing. But we can't invade because North Korea has nukes. And they'll use them on South Korea without a shadow of a doubt. But nonetheless, that's the Korean War. Often called a forgotten war because many people haven't heard of it before. Now, things are going to escalate quite a bit throughout the Cold War. At the very beginning, 1949, it was pretty scary. Besides China becoming communist, the Soviets make their first successful atomic bomb. Right? And in doing so, Americans freaked out. How did the Soviets do this? In 4 years, they would copy it. How were they able to do that? How did they get that information? Well, it turns out in Los Alamos, there was a guy who took the information to the Soviets, but he had good reason. It was 1941. It was before the U.S. joined the war. And he wanted the Soviets to beat Germany. He was a German, he escaped Germany, he hated Nazis, and he wanted Soviets to beat the Nazis. So when he was working at Los Alamos, he's like, hey, yeah, I'll help the Soviets defeat Hitler. And so he brought the material for the atomic bomb way back then. And in his eyes, the United States hadn't joined yet. He didn't know they were going to join. They were avoiding it at all costs, and he really wanted to make sure the Nazis lost that war, so he tried to help the Soviets out. He admits it. When the investigation started, he was like, I did this, and he gets 14 years in prison for that. 14 years. Keep that in mind. 1950, the U.S. decides, Truman gives a go-ahead. They make the atomic bomb, we'll make the hydrogen bomb. And let's put that in perspective. Okay, here's a map. This is Mike, the first hydrogen bomb. And if you zoom in here and then make it big, you can see that's Hiroshima and Trinity. Those are the atomic bombs compared to hydrogen bomb. And the biggest bomb the United States ever tested a few years later was a Bravo. And when they tested that, it was an accident. It was twice as big as what they thought. They first tested it, thought it'd be okay. They tested on the Bikini Atoll, and it turns out it was so massive, it was twice as big. It affected a lot of people that didn't think it would reach. It was horrible. That's the biggest one we've ever made. After that, the U.S. realized, whoa, if we were that far off our calculations, this thing is twice as big as what we expected, what's going to happen? Are we eventually going to blow up an entire continent? How bad can this get? So it seems like the Americans slow down with making the big bombs. That's what Bravo. They make more, but not a whole bunch of big ones. The Soviets would go all out and make a STAAR, and they actually have designs for STAAR too. But nonetheless, that's how far we're getting. And the idea behind it is like, they're not going to use the bomb on us because we use the bomb on them. The bomb becomes a deterrent. It deters you from wanting to fight us, essentially. Now, I do need you to circle or remember Sputnik. That's pretty important. And the thing you need to remember is it actually starts the space race. So the Soviets were the first ones to get a satellite into space, and it's a little bit bigger than basketball, and all it really can do is send a signal back, nothing much at all. But if you're American, and you know Soviets can get a satellite into space and around the Earth a few times, that should freak you out. Because if they can get a satellite into space, perhaps they can get a nuclear weapon into space. And that starts to freak us out. So we realize we're so far behind in space that we need to get started. And so this is the start of the space race. In the United States, we'll create NASA and start working toward a space agency and creating things for that. The government starts to realize, wow, we suck in math and science compared to Russia. If you want space exploration or a space race, we gotta have good math and science students. So we're gonna see state tests done in math and science. Financial aid for college will actually happen for the first time. And in that, it's because we want kids to do math and science at high levels so that they can actually compete with the Russians. So Sputnik starts the space race, essentially, that part of the Cold War. It's pretty interesting to do that. Okay. All right, at home, the Cold War at home, we see the Red Scare happening again, Red Scare Part 2, right? First one's after World War I. House of Un-American Activities Committee, also known as HUAC, they would question possible communist sympathizers. This is a House of Representatives doing this, that a committee, they set people down and they accuse them of being communists. And it's mainly celebrities, right? Writers, or sometimes scientists, but not often. And the whole idea, the whole point was to make them look guilty. And so if you were that celebrity and you refused to go in, you look guilty. If you were a celebrity and went in there and you're like, hey, this is dumb, you guys are wrong for doing this, they tore you apart, they cut you off, they made you look horrible, and they painted you in a corner and made you look evil. And you would get blacklisted, which means, blacklisted pretty much means you're not allowed to work. Nobody's gonna hire you more because you're associated with communism. And it was pretty simple. It was things like, hey, during World War II, you were in a movie and you played a communist during World War II. And you're like, yeah, World War II, they were our allies back then, so yeah, well, I did a movie. And then I would say, well, you're not that good of an actor. I think that was real. And then there are a lot of people that were communists in the 1930s. Because if you go back before World War II, it was the Great Depression. People had given up on capitalism, and some did become communist. Or some people just were married to communists. Some people lived next to communists. It didn't matter. You could be painted and targeted as a communist. And then you lost everything, your job and everything. They even went after Charlie Chaplin. Google the Great Dictator speech. Listen to it. He talks about how great democracy is. He makes fun of dictators like Hitler. And even one of the most famous celebrities at the time will be accused of it, and he'll move to France. And he can't even get back in America. When he gets an award, he tries to get a visa to come back and visit, and he can't. That's how far-reaching this whole House of Un-American Activities really is. On the flip side, you have the House and you have the Senate. The Senate's doing the same thing, but there's one guy doing it, Senator McCarthy. He's like this demigod, crazy man. He just shouts out random things. Not completely random, I know it's far out there, but he's trying to get attention. He's like, I know there's 200 people in the federal government right now that are communist. And next time they ask him, he's like, I got a list of 57, and I'm gonna name names, and I'm gonna start investigations. And he starts investigations, never finishes it. Just starts investigation after investigation after investigation. You can see this is Joseph McCarthy here. You can see people don't believe him, they don't buy it. We have created a word for this guy. It's McCarthyism. It means we make harsh accusations without evidence. Might sound like the Salem witch trials, yeah. It's a witch hunt for communism is what it is. just making accusations even though they have no evidence whatsoever. And this guy, eventually, if you wonder what happens to him, his biggest mistake is he goes from attacking celebrities and other common people to the actual U.S. Army. And in doing that, he really pissed off his own people. By the end of his own, by the end of this first year, the Republicans, his own party, will censor him. I mean, they vote and tell him he's not allowed to speak anymore. He becomes an alcoholic and dies in his 1940s. But I mean, he deserved it. He ruined people's lives by these accusations. And he was just really doing it to become famous and being loud. He looks a lot like Ted Cruz, if you ever wonder. Google Ted Cruz, McCarthy, and I'm not the only one who thinks that at all. Part of this Red Scare, there was a couple that was put on trial and convicted for treason for selling secrets. The Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, he did end up selling secrets. We find out in 1997, after the Soviet Union collapsed, we get papers called Verona papers. He did sell, but they were stupid secrets, nothing important. But he'll be put to death. His wife gets put to death for helping him, because supposedly his handwriting was so bad, when he had sent a message to the Soviets, he had her type it. And so they sentenced her to death for treason as well. They both get the electric chair. But it just shows you how bad Red Scare had gotten. The last guy got 14 years in prison for giving very important atomic secrets. Literally, it helped the Soviets make the bomb. This guy gives information, they don't even know what it is. It turns out later on it's actually nothing. It's like a propeller design or something like that. But he'll get the death penalty, and his wife does for typing for him, apparently. And the only thing the government does is they really mess with these two when they're found guilty. The government bring their 3- and 6-year-old by and say, hey, who's gonna take care of your children when you're gone? Don't you wanna live? Give us names, and we'll let you go. And both of them like, we don't have names. She was like, I don't have names to give you, I'm innocent. And he just said, I've got nothing. All I did was sell them this one thing, this one time. And so it becomes a perfect example of how strong the Red Scare Part 2 was in America with the death of these two scientists. Okay? Don't worry about the Eisenhower Doctrine. It's no longer asked on STAAR tests. It pretty much took what Truman did with Europe and said, hey, I'm applying that to the Middle East, and creates a lot of great problems that we have now. But this stuff you do need to know. You do need to know he did create the Interstate Highway Act, which is going to make all these highway systems connecting the whole country, I-10, I-45, I-35, all the stuff you think about, it's because of that. And you're thinking, why was it ever built before? For a couple hundred years, there's always been this argument. If I'm building a road from Florida to California, like I-10, who should pay for that? The federal government, because it's going across multiple states, or should each state pay their part of it? And for centuries, actually, first couple hundred years of American history, it was argued that, hey, it's not the job of the federal government to build infrastructure. That's not in the Constitution. So the federal government can't do it. But when Dwight Eisenhower becomes president, he essentially has a different idea. He says, Eisenhower says, I've been a general before. I know how important it is to move troops and supplies. I need solid, good roads for transportation for troops, supplies, nuclear weapons, whatever the case might be. If we go to war, we gotta be able to move everybody fast. We gotta be able to mobilize, and we need a highway system to do that. And in the federal government, in the Constitution, the federal government is in charge of protecting us from foreign adversaries, not the states. So the federal government is in charge of protecting us. The federal government can pay for the road. And all the interstate highways we have now, because of them. Because of Eisenhower and the Interstate Highway Act way back in the 50s. We also have the start of the baby boom, the boomers as we call them now. But after World War II, all these guys come back, millions of men come back from war, and they're ready to start families. And so they have a birth rate spike. You see a lot of people born right after World War II, and then it goes back down to low levels again. The real problem, any test is going to ask you that, the real problem with this is if you fast forward 60 years later, so many old ones and so many young ones, and so few young ones, right? You have a whole bunch of old ones, very few young ones. The biggest thing that's really messes up is retirement, pension, Social Security. That whole concept is really messed up. We have so many older people all start to retire 60 years later. That's why we call the old people boomers, because they were baby boomers right after World War II. The GI Bill is really important. The government realized, hey, what are we going to do with all these guys coming back from war? They're going to want jobs, it's going to be unemployment, it's going to be horrible. We're going to go into a relapse again, into like a Great Depression. But the government decides this is what we're going to do. Any soldier who serves in the Army, they'll be given money for homes or colleges. So even today, if you join the Army, the money you get is part of the GI Bill from 1950s. It's actually reenacted again and again and again. In this case, I only put homes on here because it plays a big role in the economy. Because now in GI, these soldiers have money for homes. We're gonna build a whole bunch more houses, which is great for economy. Construction, pouring concrete, transportation material, workers, tools, everything. If you think about America, we always judge how our economy is based on home sales and automobile sales. Either one of those are hurts, we all freak out because it means the economy's not doing that great, even if it is. But nonetheless, that's going to be one of the big things, 1950s. The fact that there's so many homes being built, there's all this pent up, everyone wants to spend. Like before World War II, it was a Great Depression. Now it's after World War II, we all want to spend. There's more products than ever before. Plastics discovered. All kinds of things are done now that was never done before. In 1950s, economic prosperity. 1950s was the best decade in the past 100 years for America. 1950s was the best decade. Second best, economically speaking, was the 90s. And third best was the 1920s, economically speaking, when you look at that. Now, everybody was supposed to conform, though. You wanted a house, the white picket fence, a nice family, not too big, not too small, and a car, and a good 8-to-5 job, and your wife had food on the table. You were supposed to conform to that. And if you didn't conform and you were different, you're far out there, people often accuse you of being weird, but also a communist. But that's what people say all the time. Even now, they're like, oh, you're out there, you believe in equal rights, you are communist. Like, it's just a bad word, really. But nonetheless, conformity was what most people did. There's one group that wasn't like that, but we'll get to that at the very end of this. For our state test, you do have to know Jonas Salk developed the polio vaccine. There's a lot of important medical advancements at the time, but that's the one that they ask about, and that's a TEKS, God knows why. First measles vaccine, first heart transplant. We actually discover antibiotic that can cure tuberculosis. Actually cure tuberculosis, and it spread, and to keep it from spreading, and actually eliminate it from the world, and we do wonders with that. And other medical advancements really pop up in the 50s. There also pops up are suburbs. You've got urban areas, and then you got outside the urban areas are suburbs. And these are houses like this that you see in this picture, and in this picture here, and over here, you see those. They start popping up more and more outside major cities because people have families, but they want jobs. You can't afford to live in a city. There's too many people living in a city. Prices are too high. You don't want to raise your family in an apartment the whole life. You want a home, you want a house, you want to have the American dream, right? And so they start building suburbs, and it was made as high as possible was transportation. Think about the cars you see from 1940s, and think about the cars in 1950s. Think of the interstate highways. In other, not our city of Houston, but other cities have subway systems. And then you have bus systems. You have all these advancements in transportation that you can very easily live outside the city, go into the city for work, and then go back home. Just think of, what's a suburb, think of Chevrolet Suburban. The whole point was everybody could load up in his car, leave the suburbs, and go to the urban area, and then come back whenever they were ready to. The suburbs, mainly because of transportation, allowed for these suburbs to get built. Some of these suburbs were pretty poorly done. It's pretty interesting stories about how they were just lies inspectors and like pour concrete and stuff like that, but it's a whole other story as well. I have a couple pictures on here to show you what women were going through in the time period. Most of them left their factory work after World War II and returned home to be stay-at-home moms. Here's a Tupperware party, which is what we call a Ponzi scheme or pyramid scheme. My students this year, for the first time, I think they're brainwashed now, and they're all pro business, and they're calling it multi-level marketing. But essentially, she gets somebody else to sell Tupperware, and she gets part of that commission. And then she'll get somebody else to sell Tupperware, and she gets commission from it, and she gets commission. So a person at the top is always getting some of the money, and the people further down get less and less and less for all the money to go around. That's first year STAAR test ever. They had the word Ponzi scheme on there. And this isn't the only one. Tupperware exists, Mary Kay, Herbalife, there's all kinds of these other ones that are Ponzi schemes. Or my students now, the pro business ones, would say that's just multi-level marketing, because that sounds nicer, essentially. You see who's controlling our TEKS right now, right? Our education. All right, two more things we gotta do is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Essentially, Cuba has become communist. The backstory goes to it is, I haven't talked about it since the Spanish-American War back in 1898, but essentially what happened was, once we freed Cuba, we controlled it. Whoever was in charge of Cuba was there with our blessing. And they were very American friendly. the leaders of Cuba would take land from the people and sell it to American corporations. They would do whatever the American government wanted. And this happened for like 50 to 60 years. At one point, the mafia had more control of Cuba than anybody else. But fast forward to this time period in Cold War, and essentially at the end of the 50s, we have a guy named Fidel Castro. He's been kicked out of Cuba. He's in exile. He gathers up 80 men or so in Mexico, sails on a boat, comes over, lands in Cuba, and he is going to free Cuba. And you're thinking, how can he do it with 80 people? Well, he's got Che with him, who's very charismatic. People love Che. But it's really because people are so poor off. When Fidel Castro and Che arrive in two separate locations, they tell people, hey, we're going to fight and get your land back. Join us. And like, nah, you're just going to do what the Americans want. He's like, no, never again. No, we're not going with the Americans. We're going to take this land. And all the American-owned land, the Americans are going to get kicked out and bring it back to the people. And the people were so poor off, they were willing to try it. Because what did they have to lose? They had nothing else to lose. And so they do this. And in just a very short time, Che and Castro are going to overthrow Cuba, and Castro becomes the new leader of Cuba. And then when the U.S. government calls, said, hey, Castro, man, great job. Understand what you do with your people. Love it. What can we do to be partners in this? And Castro says, nothing. Get out. Leave us alone. Castro will say, hey, you got Guantanamo Bay. I'm not going to mess with that. Can't touch that. That's fine. But all the other American-owned corporations, plantations, nope. Those are Cuban now. It goes to the Cuban people. Now, there was an attempt to invade Cuba called the Bay of Pigs invasion, and it was pretty bad. And then there were some attempts supposedly to assassinate Castro by the United States. As Castro realizes that he can't keep this up. He can't keep putting off fighting with America. So Castro realizes one thing: an enemy of my enemy is my friend. And the enemy of his enemy, the U.S., would be the Soviets. That's their enemy. So Castro goes, guess what? Boom. I'm now communist. Hey, Khrushchev, how's it going? Big hugs, love you guys. We're communists. Let's see America try to invade us now, because then they have to deal with the Soviets. What America does do is says, fine, you'll be communist, we're putting an embargo. No trading or selling with Cuba. So that's why Cuban cigars are illegal. That's why Cuba has all those really cool old cars from the 50s and 60s, because they never could import new ones. So they had to take care of the ones that they had. Now fast forward a little bit to 1962, a couple years later, we get the Cuban Missile Crisis. Essentially what happens, American spy plane flies over Cuba and takes this picture. And this picture, you can't see, I can't see, but military advisors can clearly see that these are missile silos. And they're big enough and large enough. The only thing that can be put here are nuclear weapons. So if you go to this map here, you'll see that if there are nuclear weapons in Cuba, they can now hit the United States with a short range and long range. Now Soviets could launch nukes and hit America for the first time. And we freak out. Kennedy freaks out. He's like, we can't have this. Now, we did do this to them. In Turkey, we had nukes there that could hit them. But we didn't think it was fair. Soviets like, all right, you're doing what you're doing. Like, what's the difference? You have some in Turkey, we have some in Cuba. It's fair is fair. This is the way it works. But we can't have that. So JFK tries to figure out what to do. His military says, we should attack Soviets now. We should attack Cuba. We should destroy it, wipe it out before they can launch anything. JFK's brother, Robert Kennedy, says, hey, stay calm, stay cool. Last time we listened to those guys, we had a failed invasion of Cuba, and it looked horribly embarrassing. It was an international nightmare. We got caught trying to overthrow a government, you know. And so JFK, he's writing letters to Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev's writing letters back. We don't know what's real, what's not. There's a big argument that he's not even writing them, that's somebody else, that they're actually trying to trick JFK to think that, hey, we're all friends here. Don't worry about it. Let us have it. You know, we don't know what's really going on. And then things escalate at one point during these 13 days. A U.S. spy plane gets shot down, and things escalate even more. JFK eventually has one solution. He goes, screw this. We're putting a blockade around Cuba, and we're going to shoot any Soviet ship that crosses that line. And people say, RFK say, hey, JFK, you can't put a blockade around Cuba. The United Nations has long since, and we agreed to this, a long time ago said a blockade is an act of war. We can't go declaring war like this. This is a war. JFK says, you tell the United Nations this isn't a blockade, it's a quarantine. So every time he receives a test question, most of the time, it's referencing to a naval blockade around Cuba, it's a Cuban Missile Crisis. Anytime it references a quarantine, it's just a word JFK used. It was still a blockade. And it came really, really close. At one point, a Soviet oil tanker actually crossed through. And instead of launching an attack on it, the soldiers actually refused to do so, and they asked higher command, and eventually like, no, just let go. It's an oil tanker, it's okay. but it could have started World War III. If we would attack them, they would attack us. And the playbook for America at the time was not small wars with Soviets. Eisenhower made that clear. He goes, it's not going to be a small war. We're going to use nukes right away if we have to. Even the Soviets actually kept some of their ships back in Europe instead of sending them. It was really intense. What actually stopped everything was RFK met with somebody from Soviet embassy, and they had a dinner one night, and RFK tells them, hey, we actually want to pull our missiles out of Turkey, but we can't do it now because it looked like we lost. Publicly, it looked bad. But if you pull yours out of Cuba, in a few months, we'll quietly pull ours out of Turkey. And so the Soviet counterpart from the embassy goes back to tell his people, they tell Khrushchev, and they go, RFK tells JFK they got a deal. Now what happens later on, we find out years later when Soviet Union falls, when we get paperwork, it turns out they didn't take all the missiles out of Cuba. But we never took them all out of Turkey either. So we both lied to each other, but it's good we did that because we were so close, because it was everybody was watching. You couldn't back down. You couldn't blink an eye. If we had given up, we would look weak. If they had given up, they would look weak. JFK actually said, hey, the reason why we got them to back down is because I was tough. The Soviets say, hey, we saved the world from total annihilation because Americans are all about war. So both sides got to say that. Publicity, they walked away with it okay. But we come so close to 13 days to World War III, the closest we've ever done before. And to avoid that in the future, JFK and Khrushchev agreed. They're both going to put a red phone in their office. And if you pick up this red phone in Washington, D.C., it automatically rings over to Soviets in Moscow, and they'll be able to answer and talk to you, and vice versa. So if you see the red phone in the Oval Office during in old movies, that's what it's referring to. It's how they can contact the Soviets directly, because we want a direct communication. So this never happened again. We don't have to worry about this again. Nowadays, they have phones, cell phones, so it's probably not there. I'm almost positive. Beatniks, they were the precursors to the hippies. They're not very well known at all, but they're important in U.S. history because hippies will change everything in the 60s and 70s, from anti-war movements and all that stuff. And we'll get to that in the next section. But for this point, the whole point in recognizing the beatniks is without the beatniks, the hippies wouldn't have developed. The beatniks were the ones that first said, hey, we're not going to be like everybody else. We're not going to have a family. We're not going to have a picket white fence. No, we're going to be different. We see the world for as it is. It's not this American dream thing. And the hippies would later on essentially grow from the beatniks into what they were, which was a major game changer. Okay. All right, that ends the early Cold War. Sorry, so many interruptions, but that's the way it works.